Okay, hi everyone. This lecture is going to be on designing cardiorespiratory exercise programs. And there's multiple components that are going to go into this lecture. So I'm going to break them up into small, shorter lectures, just like I've done with all the other materials. The first bit we're going to discuss and hopefully review cardiovascular physiology. So this is going to go into some cardiovascular changes that you see during physical activity. The next segment will be actually on programming for cardiovascular health, and then we'll go into kind of some basic endurance programming styles, and then we'll end with learning about metabolic equations. So all of this is going to be fun, but I will have to say it's pretty complex. So we'll spend some time in lab really taking what you learn from this lecture and then implementing that information, particularly those metabolic equations. So let's go ahead and start with just kind of that review of what our cardiovascular system looks like and what it does. So if you remember, there's kind of some multiple things that go into it. Stroke volume is essentially the amount of blood that goes through your heart in one beat, right? So if you look at that heart diagram, what you're thinking about is stroke volume is going to be able to pump the blood through the heart in one beat. Stroke volume is equal to your end diastolic volume minus your end systolic volume. And your end diastolic volume is usually about 120 milliliters of blood, and your end systolic volume is usually about 50 milliliters of blood. So if you take the difference between these two and you take end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume, and that's usually 120 and 50 milliliters respectively, you're going to get about 70 milliliters. That's going to measure your stroke volume. Okay, and that's kind of just in general, right? And then you have ejection fraction, and that's the amount of blood that's ejected in one beat. Another term, that just a reminder, is heart contractility, and that's how forceful your heart actually contracts with each beat. And then this concept of preload, which is where your skeletal muscle contracts during venous return, and then that end diastolic volume that stretches the right or left ventricle of the heart does its greatest dimensions under real physiological demand, right? So the harder that you're working, that end diastolic volume is going to stretch even more. All right, so now we're going to watch a short video on these concepts because I think that's going to help you remember some of these components. So what I'd like you to do, I'm not going to do it in this lecture, is I want you to stop and pause, open up your lecture, watch this video, and then when you're done, move forward with me. And I will say that these terminologies, these concepts are things that you will need to know. So if you are someone who knows the cardiovascular anatomy really well, maybe you can just move forward. But this video will certainly help people who need a little bit more of a reminder. So now let's look at some of the changes that happen in our cardiovascular system with physical activity. So we know that the more physically active we are, the thicker our ventricles are going to look. So if you look at this picture, it's not a great looking picture, right? Because it's kind of a cadaver, but it certainly helps you give you that view where you can kind of see this left ventricle here, right, is really thick compared to the myocardium of the right ventricle. And what you tend to see is that when people are really physically active and they're really engaging in a lot of cardiovascular exercise, they start to see the heart wall thicken, that myocardium thicken, and they also particularly start to see that left ventricle expand. And so that's why you see here how thick that left ventricle is. And this typically happens with kind of that moderate intensity physical activity for cardiovascular health. So people who are engaging in about 30 to 60 minutes of continuous exercise for 3 to 7 days a week are going to see these adaptations. So now let's look at some other adaptations that happen with endurance exercise. So we know that people who are regularly engaging in cardiovascular exercise are going to see an increase in their heart size. They're also going to see an increase in stroke volume and cardiac output, even though they're seeing a decrease in resting heart rate. Right? So if you remember, cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. And so you'd think, well, if I'm seeing a decrease in resting heart rate, you wouldn't see an increase in cardiac output, but that's because while they're being physically active, you're going to see that increase in cardiac output. We know that venous return is going to increase, and diastolic volume is going to increase, Blood volume is going to increase in plasma and red blood cells. So basically all of these things lead to improved cardiovascular endurance. So all of these physiological markers need to happen, all these changes need to happen in order for us to see an improvement in cardiovascular endurance. And really, what's the number one way that we measure cardiovascular endurance? Can you think about that for a moment? You should be answering changes in VO2. So the higher their VO2, basically the more aerobic capacity they have and the greater their cardiovascular endurance is. So now let's look at kind of a nice drawing for heart adaptations. And in the middle, you can see a heart that is of someone who is sedentary. And you can see RV is right ventricle and LV is left ventricle. And you can see kind of right below that is this circle, and you can see the thickness of that kind of myocardial space. And you can see that someone who's sedentary has a less thick as well as smaller myocardium compared in ventricles compared to someone who has aerobic training. Okay, so you can see this left ventricle has expanded, as has the right ventricle. And really, if you compare aerobic training compared to resistance training, aerobic training has actually you get a larger heart compared to resistance training. You certainly get a little bit more thickening with resistance training, but that heart in aerobic training still expands and gets larger. And this is just a picture to depict that as your frequency, which is here on the x-axis, goes up with cardiovascular training, so does your VO2 max, which again, VO2 max is a measure of your aerobic capacity, so how well you can utilize oxygen and expend carbon dioxide. What happens with detraining, right? So, and this is an issue, right, with us because we're dealing with clients who spend a lot of time sitting. Well, we know if people sit a lot and they're very sedentary, they're going to have a number of cardiovascular and physiological issues. This includes things like an increase in body fat, we know that, a loss of lean muscle mass. But we also know that they're going to have a reduction in the mitochondrial density, and respiratory muscle strength is actually going to decrease. And we think about respiratory muscle, what we're talking about is that diaphragmatic muscle that helps us inhale and exhale and really helps us with that breathing pattern. That's a lot of the reasons why when people are sedentary, they actually can start to develop pulmonary issues like asthma. We know body fat is going to increase, like we already said, reduce capillarization. Blood plasma volume decreases. So there's a lot of negative physiological things that happen when we're sedentary, which is why we want to get our clients to be cardiovascularly active. And here are some other changes that happen. On the left, what you can see is blood volume, and on the x-axis for each of these figures, what you see is a control, a training group, and then a detraining group. And so you can see that blood volume goes up during training and then starts to go down during detraining. Same thing with plasma volume, right? We start to see that increase and then during training and then again decrease during detraining. And then red blood cell volume, actually immediately after training, you're gonna see your red blood cell count go down, but then after you continue to train, that number is gonna go right back up. And then again, intuitively, as detraining happens, you start to see that number go down. Here are some other things to look at. Most notably probably is heart rate max and VO2. And those are the kind of the top left and then bottom right. What you see here is that if you have someone who starts trained and then goes multiple days without training, so 12 days without training, 21 days without training, all the way to 84, you can see that VO2, which is measured here as relative, so it's milliliters per kilogram per minute, you can see that VO2 dropping pretty substantially. So this person or this group goes from on average about 62 milliliters per kilogram per minute all the way down to less than 50. Okay, and that's substantial. Same thing. What's interesting here is if you look at heart rate, max, which goes from trained all the way days without training to 84, that number is going to go higher. Okay, and so something that we would expect to see is that the more physically active you are, your resting heart rate's going to go down, right? And you're going to be able to control that a little bit. So now let's go ahead and take a pause. I'm going to stop this video, and the next video is going to be on cardiovascular programming.